And welcome back to Pharmaceutical Soccer right here on 1025 The Game. Clay Tranum once again joined by Valeria Shabilla. Don't forget to check us out on social media at Pharma Soccer, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Also check out our Patreon, helps us keep the lights on. And this segment, we're welcoming back. You've seen his writing on MLSsoccer.com. You've seen it at US Soccer Players. You've seen it basically anywhere that the United States national team is talked about. Charlie Boehm, welcome to the pharmacy.
Hey, great to be here, gents.
So, Charlie, the main reason that your name popped so big a few weeks ago is that I think we're all relatively high on Nashville Soccer Club. This is a show that's for fans of Nashville Soccer Club. And maybe we get caught in our own little bubble thinking that Nashville is going to be this real big contender for to win trophies in Major League Soccer. And so we're going through all the previews. And then right there, someone picked to win the Western Conference, Nashville SC, Charlie Boehm's name right next to it. We have to ask, what is it about NSC that made you say this team right here is going to compete to win the Western Conference?
Yeah, I don't think it's. I guess it only is a limb if you look at the dominant conventional wisdom elsewhere, or among my peers. And it's I have no argument with those choices. I mean, Seattle, I think, is the consensus pick for strongest looking team overall in the league. They're just consistently good, super talented. And so I will admit that my choice was a little bit influenced by being sort of wanting to be iconoclastic and being tired of seeing the same names over and over again. But when I thought through things a little bit, on the one hand, I'm always nervous about the extra mileage that Nashville's taking on, and the being in the West, having to deal with the elite of the Western Conference, which is, has kind of driven the league, I think, for the better part of the last half decade or more. But when I look at what Nashville has done so far in MLS and how they've built on the foundation that they started with, I just think there's a really good chance of them making a big step forward this year. I mean, they're just such a tough team to beat. And again, the identity is so clear in terms of the organization, the intensity, the tenacity that they have. It's an older team, which tends to make me a little bit nervous when we talk about, a long, difficult, physically grinding regular season. But I think also there's more depth there than a lot in the national media realize. And again, in the big picture, it's, this sturdy base that, of making, not giving up goals, being organized, being tough to play against. And then, for the, almost really since year one, right, Nashville has been trying to sort of garnish that with good finishers and creativity up top. And there's been a little bit of turnover there, and that's a little bit of a concern. I'm sure you guys talk about that a fair amount. But they've spent a gradually increasing amount of money in those positions. And when we look at those investments and maybe things kind of finally coming together and taking shape in 2022, I'm feeling okay about it.
So one of the things that people talk about, especially with these like CONCACAF Champions League teams, is weathering the storm of the early season. So Nashville doesn't necessarily have, extra matches to fit in, but over half their road trips are going to take place in this first chunk of the season. So if they're able to weather the storm, then they're perhaps better positioned, I guess, than other would-be contenders in the standings. And with a veteran-laden team, it's not like they don't know how to start a season, right?
Yeah, and I think there's multiple examples of these kind of long season opening road trips, usually but not always driven by stadium timelines. It's not ideal, but backloading can give you a really great opportunity to build momentum at home down the stretch. And the early season games, the first several weeks of the season, are often, teams are incomplete, right? And the finishing touches, like attacking movements, final third movements, finishing rhythms, those are often not in place. So I think you're going to see Nashville, keep grinding, probably take away a lot of 1-1s and 0-0s and that sort of thing. And so they know how to do that, as you mentioned. And if they just put themselves in the right frame of mind to where they can, go home, open up the new place, get all the euphoria that comes from that, and then start to sort of, and it's not a given, right, that you're going to win right away at your home venues. And you look around the league, there's some teams that haven't gotten used to the new venue, and sometimes that's more challenging than you might expect. But assuming they get the breaks there and can start to build the belief and again incorporate the new stadium into the identity, then I think you could see them go on a real roll.
So I was in Minnesota, obviously, for this past game, and I was talking to some of the fans there and some of the people there, and they were kind of like, "Oh, you guys came out of nowhere. Like we didn't really know Nashville or kind of expected Nashville to be that." So I'm curious, how well do you think the West knows Nashville? Because we haven't really played outside of the Eastern Conference all that much in the first 2 years of the existence of this club.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been maybe a bigger, more eye-catching story or team, right? When the team you came in with, your expansion brethren, then the nature of how Nashville has chosen to play, the fact that they were not splashy in terms of the moves they made. I mean, the model I think we can clearly see has worked, right? And the way they deployed their allocation money, the type of personalities they sought, the way Gary Smith was sort of brought in and given that nice long lead, got started in USL and was able to apply his lessons from the past of his past time in MLS to the evolution both of the league and him personally. I mean, I think we're seeing growth in him as a coach that probably doesn't get talked about enough outside of Nashville. It just hasn't been, it hasn't been sexy, for lack of a better word. But now I think maybe that's going to change with the new stadium. And for better or worse, the TV schedule really dictates a lot of this, because there's those of us that are watching, many games per week or trying to watch as many as possible. I mean, even for me, who's immersed in this professionally, it is a slog to get through as many minutes of 14 games a weekend as possible, right? And then once we start cranking in midweek games, in the coming months, then it'll be even crazier. So it's very easy to drift, for your attention to drift a little bit outside of your team, your environment, maybe your rivals. And so Nashville's still young in that regard, and there's those factors that add up. And again, the way Nashville plays too, right? I mean, they if you're paying attention, you see it. But when a casual fan is sort of scrolling down the calendar and looking at the schedule, that may not be the matchup that grabs their attention. So, but all these things are really you can look at them as compliments as well. It's as much as or more so than slights, because it's just a sign of, I think, the organization that put sort of substance over style in almost every opportunity in this process. And this is one of the, I guess, downsides, if you can say that, but it's one that I'm sure you guys will happily accept.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I think maybe has happened the last, because we talked about kind of being in our own bubble, sitting here last year, watching the way that it took so long for the narrative to kind of flip on Nashville alone, but not also Nashville, Hani Mukhtar, who had statistically just an incredible season last year and then carried it on into the playoffs. Unfortunately, we won't talk about the penalty kicks, but but other than that, seeing that sort of narrative shift, and now you see people coming out, like yourself included, saying, I mean, Hani Mukhtar is one of the best players in the league. And your cohort, Pablo, who obviously has some Nashville ties, called him his favorite player to watch in the league. So maybe that sort of starts to shift the way that people look into Nashville games, is maybe someone that they can now tie into and know that they want to watch.
But and I guess there's a cautionary note here as well, which is that that was, I'm sure you guys read, the big question for a lot of pundits was, does Nashville have another trick beyond the sort of, I don't know what Catenaccio that might not be fair, but can you create chances with a higher volume? Can you finish those chances more regularly? Can some of these players, these attacking players that have had pretty legit money splashed on them, right, start to show that they're worth that? And I think we're still waiting, I think, a little bit to see there. Maybe that doesn't, really get an opportunity to take center stage until the new stadium opens up. But that's a challenge. I mean, making yourself tough to beat is an achievement. It's one that they deserve credit for. But then typically, if you want to get to where an ambitious team wants to go, you have to build on that. And so I think that's going to be the question. Is Mukhtar going to be able to do what he did last year consistently? He overperformed his numbers a little bit. Does he return to the mean in certain senses, or does it become a little bit more of a collective with a little more dynamism with others helping out? I mean, I'm a big Randall Leal fan as well, a big fan of what he brings to the table. And then I'm hoping to see Loba. I was hoping to ask you guys and pick your brains a little bit about where he stands, because he's a very, very intriguing puzzle piece in all this.
There were a lot of positive remarks about Loba in the preseason, especially from Gary Smith. He said he was working harder than he's ever seen him, and he had one of his best game in a Nashville SC shirt in a preseason match. And this is all coming directly from Gary. But unfortunately, the first two games we didn't see him start, and that's okay. You have somebody who knows how to score in CJ Sapong, but I think my worry a little bit is that Teal Bunbury beat Loba onto the field twice now. So I'm a little curious about that, and I think Gary wants to play him in a different role and all that. But it's this team has the mentality, or had the mentality, I guess, the past couple of years of being the underdogs, and I think Gary Smith kind of sold the idea that, hey, they don't want to see us here. Let's go out there and let's show these people what Nashville's about. But it's kind of hard to sell that mentality when you look at the predictions and Nashville is in the top three of almost every single MLS rider. So, how do you think, or how should Gary Smith motivate his team now? Is because you can't play that card anymore.
I think half the league tries to play "we're the big underdog" like
Yeah,
card.
it's
I think
pretty
half the
pitiful.
managers in the league try it.
I find it frustrating, and I say pitiful. I'm over inflating it a tad bit, but not too much, because it's infuriating to see how often this gets trotted out. But it happens for a reason, right? This is this is a psychological gambit that is done a lot because it meshes well with the mentality that a lot of top athletes have. These guys have overcome the odds just to get to a first team MLS or top flight roster, right? And they're constantly battling the psychological stress of being in that environment, right? Where you're exposed. Everything you do is watched and reviewed and dissected, and in some cases even attacked or targeted by the opposition, by fans, by pundits. And so I think it's easy to make players believe that they have something to prove, that they have someone to prove wrong. And so as annoying as it can be for us on the outside, or as irrational almost, I don't think that Gary will have a hard time with it, given that it's, again, building on what's already been done. But again, there's going to come a time, very soon here, where they are going to be favored. It's not just what you're doing; it's also what the opposition does, right? MLS is famously a copycat league. It's a league of adjustment of game plans, where over time players and systems get found out, or at least get known, right? And then you have to raise your level at what you do, or find different wrinkles to it. And again, maybe this is just because they're fresh in my mind from watching and writing about the game last night. But the Portland Timbers are maybe a useful case to look at here. Under Gio Savarese, they've been a consistent contender. They always do well in knockout tournaments. They won MLS's back. They've been to 2 MLS Cup finals, and it seems like almost every year, at some point or another, we hear Savarese and people around the Timbers talking about trying to be better with the ball, be more proactive, be less reactive. And sometimes they go back and forth, and they have good and bad games where they try to be more expansive and more proactive. But when it comes to crunch time, they tend to revert back to who they are, right? And what they are, and what the sort of psychological and chemical chemistry makeup is of their group. And so I think with Nashville, we now see what that baseline is. But when you watch the Timbers, even within one game, they'll shift formations, they'll make adjustments, they'll come out and press. Like they pressed LAFC. The first stages of the game last night in LA were really open, really fun. end-to-end stuff at times, and then they'll like flip a switch and they'll drop in, right, or they'll focus on certain matchups. So I mean, good coaches, and I definitely consider Gary Smith to be one of those, will begin to add those little details and those nuances to things, and it's much easier to do that once you've got a few months or weeks of games under your belt. You're never almost never there by this point in the season.
And we've even seen that in the last year with Nashville, because Nashville through the summer certainly looked like a more expansive team. But the second they got to the nitty gritty towards the end of the season, trying to lock in that, trying to maintain that spot with a home playoff game, the games went back to being 1-0, 1-1 sort of things. We had to talk about it a lot on this show. That's part of the reason they drew so often, is because drawing was very pragmatic at the time
Mm-hmm.
when there are all these road matches. So we've seen it play out sort of in that way. Kind of shifting a little bit here to a big picture vibe. Uh, we've talked a few times over the years we've had you on this show. There's a lot of talk about like, how do we rate Nashville as a model for expansion, right? Like, you can't be the LAFC, the Atlanta, where they spend a whole bunch of money, win some silverware, but then it kind of fizzles out pretty quickly. And then you look at something like a team like Seattle, which has maintained sort of this level that they've been at for the majority of their time in Major League Soccer. You sort of look at, it barely counts, but like Chicago, the first like 6 years that they were around, were consistently good. So like, how do we look at this Nashville team when we talk about expansion teams coming into the league? Like, do we still consider them, even without the silverware, in that group with Atlanta and LA, or is it still to be determined?
Ooh, that's a fun one. Yeah, I mean, the Atlanta and LA were undoubtedly their ceiling was raised compared to Nashville's by the sheer amount of firepower they had, and there was some pretty good coaching involved there too. And players like Vela, uh, Joseph Martinez, Almiron, they're when they are, if you find the right ones that can stay fit, can stay dialed in, who can apply their best traits in an endless environment, they are such force multipliers, right? And that's something that you don't have to spend big to get it, but it sure is easier. The easiest way to do it is to go out and make good but big investments on the market. And I think you have to, when we look back a little now, right? I mean, Atlanta hasn't hit those highs in some time. They had a perfect storm come together in a positive way those first 2 years, and then consolidating it was another matter entirely, right? And I mean, that's one of my frustrations, I think, with modern MLS or MLS in total, is that there's such built-in churn between the salary budget and the sort of like queen blanket on a king size bed that faces you with, that you it's so hard to keep good teams together. It's hard for good players to be rewarded for their performances without getting shipped around or becoming pieces that get swapped around the league. I mean, there's so much built-in instability. I think it's a little bit frustrating for me, just from sort of a neutral perspective. I mean, I don't know. It's hard, like, because that's those two teams, and maybe if we look at Chicago Fire, but that was almost like another league, 2 decades ago now. When you look at those teams, like really, I think they're the exceptions that prove the rule. How difficult it is, how much has to go right for you out of the gates in the expansion scenario. Um, Nashville is, I think, maybe in some ways is even more. It's impressive in a different way because they were able to be consistent, right, and do it without necessarily being as splashy. And the shift from it used to be that coming up from a lower division and having an established team and organization was this huge benefit. 10 years ago or so, that was the state of affairs with expansion teams. Now, though, when you have Atlanta and Charlotte and teams like that are ready to do things big from the jump, it's a little different. But I really like the way Nashville did things in terms of sustainability, growing off what they had. Because every market is different, and in that case, you're not only building your team, you're building the soccer landscape really in your city, right, in your region, which is I think that the challenge there was more substantial than a lot of outsiders realize.
Yeah, yeah, and for Nashville, a lot of it, I think a lot of it was built on that mentality. I don't know why I'm going back to this, but because we just saw it going back every time to that, like, nobody talks about us, nobody wants to see us here, and then that kind of drove into the fan base as well. Because Enter Miami came in at the same time as Nashville, and like you mentioned earlier on this show, like Inter Miami got all the publicity, all the David Beckham, classic sort of highlights and all that, and they got the Matuides, they got the Higuains, and Nashville was kind of like, well, here's Dax McCarty and Anibal Godoy in midfield, like, which isn't an easy product to sell, I guess. But I am just curious, how do you think things would have been different if that sort of COVID break didn't happen for this market? Because for us, 60,000 people showed up for that first game. Similar to what we're seeing in Charlotte. Obviously, they have it in a bigger stage. Um, and I just always find myself thinking back to that moment and saying, what if the season continued on, and what would have happened versus what's going to happen now with the stadium, with the new stadium being open.
Yeah, I think everybody suffered. I mean, well, let's just look at it and set aside the individual suffering. I mean, the clubs around MLS and Northern American soccer in general. There's a lot of suffering that was imposed by the pandemic, but I think it was the worst for the new teams, and then the sort of relaunch teams. I mean, I put the Fire in this boat as well. Chicago, Miami, Nashville are trying to make a new or first impression on their marketplace and their fan base, and you just can't go back, right? You can't get that time back. I think the benefit in all those in Miami and Nashville situation is that a new stadium, assuming Miami eventually get theirs, Nashville, we're just a few weeks away. That always gives you that other, you know, uh, pivoting opportunity, right? And that chance to sort of vault yourself into the conversation, change or advance the conversation, and get a boost there. And it was tough. But the other thing I would caution, and it's like I guess it's good that we're discussing this because I've restrained myself from talking about this weekend because you never want to yuck someone else's yum, right? And it's a huge achievement what Charlotte did. Filling that stadium, even getting close to filling that stadium under any circumstances is a big achievement. Breaking that record, I thought it was great. The vision I think that they showed to say, okay, the first thing we can do, on field results are elusive, right? And hard to control. But if we want to be in the Atlanta conversation, if we want to really step up and have this rivalry with this more established team that's our neighbors, the first area we can attack is this attendance record that they have, right? And they're still, what is it, 4 of the top 5 or something, or right. The single game regular season attendance marks are held by Atlanta. So I thought it was smart just for them to sort of get themselves in that conversation and have that in that mind space for people. But it's fundamentally just like I would say about Atlanta's first game, Charlotte's first game, Nashville's first game. There's and the same thing I say about the international friendlies when we see 100,000 people show up in Michigan to see whatever it was, Madrid, Manchester United, or whoever that was. That's great, and it's great that there's enough soccer fans to fill, a Big Ten football stadium. But that's an event. That's event marketing. That's an event mentality. It's an event consumer. It's just, to me, it's like you can use that to segue, you can build momentum, but the challenge of filling a stadium over the course of a season, of cultivating a fan base to be excited, home and away, to incorporate your team into their lives, their sense of self, their sense of community, that is just like so many times harder and more complicated. And and I'll tell you, I'm not the only one of my colleagues who's saying this. Let's check back in August. Let's see what the stadium looks like when it's hot as hell outside. Maybe they're on a 5-game winless streak or whatever, and the turf is burning up, and a lot of the popular players are tired or hurt. Like the real work lies ahead. I have no qualms about Charlotte's ability to handle all that, but let's keep in mind that perspective, I think.
Yeah, I think that's pretty instructive. I mean, we talked about that a lot last year. Like, what's it going to be like in the dog days of June and July? So, one of the things, I was in Seattle for the opener last the previous week, and one of the things I've noticed, having gone to a lot of MLS stadiums before Nashville existed, after him being in the cities, is there's very few cities in this league where it's game day. Like, if the Titans are playing in Nashville, the Titans are playing. If the Preds are playing, the Preds are playing. Kind of wherever you are in town, and you see it in radio, you see it in the coverage. And the only places in this league that I've been where you really get that sense is the ones you expected to be. In Seattle, if you're anywhere in Seattle and Seattle's playing, people at least have a vague sense that the Sounders are playing that day. I haven't been to Portland, but I've been told it's the same way there. Atlanta definitely has that. And I am skeptical that Charlotte will be anywhere in that, knowing what we deal with here in Nashville, where I think people are still surprised that the team's been is here, much less has been here for 3 years. And that is, I don't think that any other leagues really have to deal with it to that extent, and that, like, in the US. And that is the part that kind of, every time I see a big attendance number, like you said, like, that's the part that kind of sticks in my head. It's like, well, we had a million people show up for the NFL draft at a time when the Titans were getting maybe 30,000, 40,000 in the stadium. It's a lot easier to push those major events.
It's all about you made an introduction to those 74th odd thousand people, and that's outstanding. That's a priceless email list and experience, and hopefully you hooked them, right? You want to hook as big a percentage of them as you can and get them to come back a second time. Get to know things, maybe start to do a little more searching, spend a little more time on your website, start talking to people around them. And that can snowball. Amazing things can happen from there. But this is just the first step. And we do have, I think, we have an infatuation with the new MLS. It's a snake that's shed its skin once or twice or thrice over. And that's, again, all natural and understandable. And you want to be inclusive and excited about the newcomers and what they're going through. But the sustaining it is a tougher one. And I've come to see this as we live in an attention economy. The most valuable and elusive quantity is people's attention and investment on a personal level. And that will take a little more time to sort of gauge.
All right, and that seems like a good note to leave things on. We'll see with Charlotte. Nashville looks pretty good. Charlie, we're very happy to have you back in the pharmacy. We'll probably check in at some point in the future, especially, if the predictions play out the way that you predict, which none of us on this show have predicted, but we're very excited that you did.
Hey guys, I'm prepared to get killed either way. Predictions, as I will say all day long, are a fool's game. I wish they weren't such a big part of what we do, but that's the reality. And so might as well dive in and get ready for the November, October timeframe dunking. We all know it's out there.
All right, and we'll be back with our final segment. You're listening to Pharmaceutical Soccer right here on 102.5 The Game.